What would you do if saving one dying stranger meant waking up to 30 armed warriors surrounding your home? In 1872, a forgotten widow made a choice that should have gotten her killed, but instead, it shattered everything she thought she knew about enemies, belonging, and the true cost of kindness in a land that forgave nothing. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible stories tomorrow. Also, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now, let's continue with the story. The Arizona sky was bleeding purple when Eunice Hadley heard the sound that would change everything. Not a knock, not a call, just a wet, desperate gasp near her well. She stood at her kitchen window, a woman whose body had become her prison in a territory that already had no use for her. 43 years old, 260 pounds, and widow to a man who'd left her nothing but debt and a water station 5 miles from anywhere that mattered. The new trail had opened last spring, pulling travelers away from her little outpost like blood from a wound. Now, Bitter Creek Station was just another place the desert was swallowing whole. The sound came again, weaker this time. Eunice grabbed the rifle from above the door, her hands shaking as she pushed outside. The November wind cut through her dress, carrying the smell of creosote and something else. Something copper. That's when she saw him. A young man lay crumpled beside her well, his body twisted wrong, dark blood pooling in the dust beneath him. Navajo, she realized with a jolt of fear that shot through her chest. His deerskin shirt was shredded, arrows still jutting from the dirt nearby like someone had tried to finish what they started. His face was gray with shock, eyes rolling white, but when she stepped closer, those eyes found hers. He tried to speak. Failed. Tried again. Water. The word came out in English, broken and raw. Every warning she'd ever heard screamed in her head. Don't trust them. They'll kill you in your sleep. They're animals. The townspeople of Bitter Creek, 3 hours' ride south, had made their position clear enough. Just last month, they'd cheered when the cavalry burned a Navajo settlement 40 miles north. Women and children, someone had said, couldn't be helped. But Eunice looked at this dying boy, maybe 19 or 20, and saw only the same thing she'd seen in her mirror every morning for 2 years. Desperation. The kind that makes you invisible. Her hands moved before her mind could catch up. She dropped the rifle, grabbed the ladle from the well, and brought water to his cracked lips. He drank like a man drowning in air, and when he looked at her again, something passed between them that had no language. "I'll get you inside," she whispered, knowing with absolute certainty that this kindness might be the last thing she ever did. She didn't know that by sunrise, 30 warriors would be sitting silent as ghosts around her home, or that her simple act of mercy had just made her the most dangerous woman in the territory. Getting him into the storage shed took everything Eunice had. She dragged him across 30 feet of hard ground, his blood leaving a trail she'd have to explain if anyone came looking. Her back screamed, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop until he was hidden behind sacks of grain nobody wanted to buy anymore. She lit a lamp with trembling fingers and really saw him for the first time. 3 deep cuts across his ribs, a gash on his thigh that hadn't stopped bleeding, bruises that told the story of fists and boots. This wasn't a hunting accident. Someone had tried to murder him. Eunice tore her spare dress into strips, her mind racing. 24 months ago, she'd been invisible but safe. Her husband Samuel had been a drunk and a fool, but at least his presence kept the vultures at bay. Then he'd died falling off his horse, too liquored up to hold on. And suddenly, Bitter Creek Station belonged to a fat woman with no protection and debts she couldn't pay. The townspeople had started the jokes within a week. The Elephant's Rest, they called her place. Gideon Foss, the land speculator with eyes like a snake, had offered her $50 for property worth $300. When she refused, he'd laughed and said time would change her mind. That was 14 months ago. He hadn't been wrong. The water station was dying by degrees, and so was she. She pressed cloth against the warrior's ribs, and his eyes snapped open. He grabbed her wrist with shocking strength, his gaze wild with fever and confusion. For 3 heartbeats they stayed frozen like that, predator and prey. Except Eunice couldn't tell which one she was supposed to be. Then his grip loosened. His breathing slowed. He was looking at her face, really looking, and whatever he saw there made something shift in his expression. He said something in his language, soft, almost like a question. "I don't understand," Eunice whispered. "But you're safe here. I promise." She had no idea if he understood English, but he released her wrist and closed his eyes again. Trust or surrender, she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Through the long night, she worked. Cleaning wounds, changing bandages, bringing water to his lips. Every hour. The shed smelled like blood and sweat, and the lavender soap she used because it reminded her of her mother. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the empty land, and Eunice realized she hadn't felt this needed since before Samuel died. This stranger was dying in her shed, and tending to him felt like the first honest thing she'd done in years. Near dawn, his fever broke enough for his eyes to open again. He looked at her for a long moment, then whispered something that sounded like gratitude before unconsciousness took him back under. Eunice stepped outside to draw fresh water from the well, exhausted, but strangely calm. That's when she saw them. 30 mounted warriors, arranged in a perfect semicircle around her property, so still they might have been carved from stone, waiting, watching, silent as death itself. The bucket slipped from her hands and shattered on the ground. Eunice's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack through. The warriors sat their horses like they'd been waiting there for hours, maybe all night. How had she not heard them arrive? The sun was just beginning to paint the desert gold, and in that early light, she could see details that made her mouth go dry. War paint, rifles, faces that showed nothing, gave nothing, promised nothing. One warrior dismounted. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He moved toward her with the slow certainty of a man who'd never had to rush toward violence. Eunice wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to grab the rifle she'd left inside like an idiot. But her legs had turned to stone, and all she could do was stand there while he closed the distance between them. He stopped 3 feet away. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but they swept over her face, her body, the shed behind her. Calculating, judging. She'd seen that look before, usually right before someone made a cruel joke about her size. But this man wasn't laughing. He said something in his language. A question, she thought, but the words meant nothing to her. When she didn't respond, he gestured toward the shed with his chin, a simple movement that somehow contained a command. Eunice's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. "He's alive," she managed. "I helped him." The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly. He gestured again, more insistently this time, and Eunice understood. He wanted to see. She led him across the yard on legs that barely held her weight. The other warriors remained mounted, perfectly still, watching everything. She felt their eyes like physical weight. Inside the shed, the young man lay exactly as she'd left him, breathing shallow but steady. The warrior knelt beside him with a speed that surprised her for a man his age. His hands moved over the wounds, checking her bandage work, testing for fever. Eunice held her breath. She'd done her best, but what if it wasn't enough? What if they thought she'd hurt him instead of helping? What if this was about to become her tomb? The warrior spoke to his nephew, his voice low and urgent. The young man's eyes fluttered open, and he responded in words too weak to hear. Whatever he said made the older warrior go very still. Then he turned to look at Eunice, and for the first time since Samuel died, someone truly saw her. Not the fat widow, not the joke, not the failure. Just a woman who'd done something she didn't have to do. The warrior stood slowly. He placed his right hand over his heart, then extended it toward her, palm down, and bowed his head. Eunice felt something crack, open in her chest. She didn't know what the gesture meant exactly, but she understood respect when she saw it. After 2 years of invisible cruelty, this stranger was giving her what her own people had stolen. The warrior spoke again, and though she couldn't understand the words, his tone held no threat. He moved past her, back into the sunlight, and called out something to the others. The warriors dismounted. The warriors made camp just beyond her property line, close enough to protect but far enough to avoid provocation. Eunice watched from her window, still not quite believing what was happening. These were supposed to be her enemies, the monsters the townspeople warned about. But they moved with quiet efficiency, setting up shelters, tending horses, building small fires that barely smoked. By midday, 3 women appeared. They came on foot, carrying baskets and clay pots, moving toward her shed without hesitation. Eunice stepped outside, unsure whether to welcome them or run. But the oldest woman smiled at her, actually smiled, warm and genuine, like they were neighbors meeting over a fence. The woman pointed to herself. "Desba." "Eunice," she replied, her voice shaking. Desba nodded, then gestured toward the shed, the universal language of concern. They went inside together, and what happened next felt like stepping into a different world. The women unpacked their baskets with practiced hands, plants Eunice had never seen, ground into pastes that smelled like earth and rain. They removed her bandages without judgment, making soft sounds as they examined the wounds. Then they worked, applying medicines, rewrapping with strips of soft leather, moving with a knowledge that made Eunice's clumsy attempts look childish. But they didn't push her aside. Instead, Desba guided Eunice's hands, showing her how to press the poultice just right, how to wrap without cutting off blood flow. Teaching her. The young warrior, who Desba called Ashki through gestures and broken words, watched through fever-bright eyes. He said something that made the women laugh softly, and Desba patted Eunice's arm. "Good," Desba said in careful English. "You good." Those 2 words hit harder than any insult Bitter Creek had ever thrown at her. Over the next 6 days, a routine emerged that felt like something out of a dream. The women came 3 times daily, always bringing food, cornmeal cakes, dried meat, stews that tasted like nothing Eunice had ever made. They ate together in the shed, and slowly, through gestures and Desba's growing English, they began to communicate. Eunice learned that Ashki was training to be a healer, that Mexican raiders had ambushed him near the border, stealing his medicine bag and leaving him for dead. That the scarred warrior was Hastian Nez, his uncle and war leader. She taught them how her water pump worked, showed them her dead vegetable garden, and found herself laughing for the first time in months when one of the younger women tried to teach her a Navajo word, and Eunice butchered it so badly everyone doubled over. But underneath the growing warmth, Eunice noticed things. The way the warriors watched the horizon constantly. How they never all slept at once. The tension in Hastien Nez's shoulders whenever he looked south toward Bitter Creek. On the 7th morning, Ashki sat up on his own. His color was better, his eyes clear. He looked at Eunice and spoke in halting English. "Why you help me?" Before she could answer, hoofbeats thundered in the distance, many of them, coming fast. Hastien Nez barked orders, and every warrior grabbed their weapon. The townspeople had found out. 15 riders came over the ridge like a dust storm, given human form. Eunice recognized the man leading them before she could even make out his face. Gideon Foss sat his horse like he owned the world, and behind him rode every angry drunk and bored ranch hand from Bitter Creek. They reined up 50 feet from her porch, guns visible, faces hard with righteous fury. Foss dismounted slowly, making a show of it, his smile sharp enough to cut. "Well now, Eunice," he called out, his voice dripping false concern. "Heard you've been entertaining guests, the kind that scalp white women in their sleep." "He was dying," Eunice said, forcing herself to step forward even though her legs wanted to collapse. "I gave him water." "You gave aid to a hostile." Foss spat tobacco juice into her dirt. "That makes you a traitor, and it makes this property forfeit. You've got one chance here. Hand over the savage, send his war party packing, and maybe we forget this ever happened." "There is no war party. These are his family." Foss laughed, and his men joined in, a chorus of cruelty Eunice knew too well. "His family? Jesus, you're dumber than you are fat. These animals are probably planning to slit your throat the second you turn around." Heat flooded Eunice's face, but before she could respond, movement rippled through the Navajo camp. The warriors rose as one, rifles in hand, forming a line between Foss and the shed. Hastien Nez walked forward until he stood beside Eunice, his presence solid as stone. The laughter died. "You're making a mistake, lady," Foss said, his hand drifting toward his pistol. "These savages got no rights here. We're well within our legal authority to remove them by force." "Try it," Eunice heard herself say. The words came out steadier than she felt. "Try it, and see what happens." Foss's eyes went cold. "You threatening me? You think I won't burn this whole station down with you inside it?" Hastien Nez spoke then, his voice carrying across the yard in fluid Spanish that Eunice didn't understand, but Foss clearly did. Whatever he said made Foss's face go red, then pale. "He says," came Desba's voice from behind Eunice, "any harm to the woman who saved his nephew means war. He says, you are coward who brings many men to frighten one woman. He says, leave now or stay forever." The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Foss looked at his men, then at the warriors, calculating odds that wouldn't work in his favor. 30 trained fighters against 15 drunks. Bad math. "This isn't over," Foss finally said, mounting his horse with exaggerated calm. "Not by a long shot. The law's on my side, and I'll be back with proper authority. Then we'll see how brave your savage friends are." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed. But Eunice saw the look he threw back over his shoulder. Pure hatred mixed with wounded pride. The most dangerous combination there was. As the dust settled, Hastien Nez turned to her and spoke words Desba translated with quiet urgency. "He says the rattlesnake will return with more snakes. He says we have made you a target." 2 days after Foss's visit, Ashki stood for the first time. Eunice was drawing water when she heard movement behind her and turned to find him leaning against the shed doorway, pale but upright. "You should be resting," she said, rushing over. "I rest too much." His English was rough but clear. "Need to be strong when soldiers come." The certainty in his voice chilled her. Not if. When? They sat together on the porch steps, the morning sun warm on their faces. Ashki moved carefully, his healing ribs making each breath deliberate. For a long moment, neither spoke. "Why you help me?" he asked again, the question he'd tried to ask before Foss interrupted. "You not know me. Your people and my people, we are enemies." Eunice looked at her hands, large and worn, and marked by years of work nobody appreciated. "I've been invisible for 2 years. Since my husband died, people look through me like I'm not there, or they look at me and see something to mock. The elephant, they call me. A joke." She paused, surprised at her own honesty. "But when you looked at me that first night, asking for water, you saw a person who could help. Not what I weighed, not what I'd lost. Just someone who might choose kindness. I haven't been seen like that in so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like." Ashki listened with an intensity that made her chest tight. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "My people, we say water is sacred, not just for drinking. Water is life itself, the first gift, the one that cannot be bought or owned. When you gave me water, you gave peace of your spirit." He touched his chest over his heart. "Among my people, this debt is forever. You are family now." Family. The word hit like a physical thing. Eunice felt tears sting her eyes and blinked them back. Over the following days, something beautiful and strange took root. Ashki taught her about desert plants, which ones healed and which ones killed. He showed her how to read coming weather in the clouds, sang her songs his grandmother taught him about the 4 sacred mountains. His voice was soft but certain, carrying melodies that seemed older than the land itself. She taught him more English, shared stories about Pennsylvania winters and her mother's flower garden, showed him how to fix the pump's stubborn valve, and laughed when he got covered in rust water. Desba and the other women taught her beadwork, their patient hands guiding hers through patterns that told stories without words. She taught them her mother's bread recipe, and they taught her songs for grinding corn. One cold morning, Hasti Inez appeared on her porch, holding a thick blanket woven in colors that caught the light like sunset. He pressed it into her hands without ceremony, but his eyes were kind. Eunice clutched the blanket and cried, not from sadness, but from the shocking weight of being cared for. But that afternoon, dust rose on the southern horizon. Not 15 riders this time, more than 30. With a wagon that carried the territorial flag. Foss had brought the law. Marshal Pruitt looked tired. That was Eunice's first thought when the lawman dismounted, his badge catching sunlight like a warning. He was maybe 60, with gray stubble and eyes that had seen too much violence to enjoy it anymore. Behind him, 12 soldiers sat their horses with the bored efficiency of men following orders they didn't question. Foss rode beside the marshal, wearing a smile that made Eunice's skin crawl. "Mrs. Hadley," Pruitt said, his voice carrying neither warmth nor hostility. "I'm here on official territorial business. Reports say you're harboring hostile Navajo in violation of treaty restrictions and settlement security protocols." "They're not hostile," Eunice said. "They're a family protecting one of their own." "Ma'am, with respect, that's not for you to determine." Pruitt gestured toward the Navajo camp, where warriors now stood armed and ready. Current treaties prohibit unauthorized Navajo presence this far from designated lands. I've got authority to disperse them by force if necessary, and to arrest anyone impeding that action. Foss leaned forward in his saddle. Told you, Marshal. She's been playing house with savages while they plan God knows what. Mr. Foss, I'll handle this, Pruitt said sharply, then turned back to Eunice. I don't want violence here, but I've got my orders. These people need to leave, or I have to enforce the law. Nez stepped forward, his warriors moving with him. The soldiers' hands drifted toward their rifles. Eunice felt the moment teetering on the edge of something terrible. Wait, she said, stepping between them again, her heart hammering. Just wait. Marshal, can I speak? Pruitt studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Go ahead. That young man in my shed was attacked by Mexican raiders, the same ones who've been hitting homesteads and settlements for months. He's not a threat. He's a victim. Her voice gained strength as she spoke. These people saved my life by giving it meaning after 2 years of being treated like garbage by my own kind. They brought medicine, food, and respect. Not once have they threatened anyone except in self-defense. If that's what we call hostile, then maybe we need better words. She's lying to protect them, Foss cut in. Probably planning to sell them guns or whiskey. I can testify, Eunice said, ignoring him. On record. About the raiders, about everything. I'll swear to whatever you need. Something shifted in Pruitt's expression. Maybe recognition. Maybe respect. He looked at the Navajo warriors, then at Foss, then back at Eunice. This is highly irregular, he said slowly. So is condemning innocent people for existing, Eunice replied. The silence stretched thin. A soldier's horse stamped nervously. Somewhere a crow called. Finally, Pruitt exhaled like a man making a decision he'd regret either way. I'll give you 48 hours to resolve this. After that, I enforce the order. No exceptions. He mounted his horse, then paused. Mrs. Hadley, I hope you know what you're doing. As the soldiers rode away, Foss lingered long enough to mouth 2 words at her. You're dead. That night, they gathered in Eunice's kitchen. Nez, Ashki, Desba, and 2 other elders, whose names Eunice still struggled to pronounce. The lamp between them cast shadows that danced like ghosts across their faces. Desba translated as Nez spoke, his words measured and heavy. My uncle says we must leave before the soldiers return. To stay puts everyone in danger, especially you. But he wants you to understand something. Desba paused, her eyes meeting Eunice's. You have given us great honor. This will not be forgotten. Eunice's throat tightened. Where will you go? Back to our lands, Ashki said. His wounds were healing well, but he still moved carefully. To our families. Back to their lives. Back to the world that made sense. And she would return to her dying water station, her invisible existence, the slow suffocation of being nobody to no one. There's another choice, Ashki said quietly. Nez nodded, and Desba leaned forward. 60 miles northeast, there is a place called 3 Rivers, Desba explained. Trading post run by mixed family. Navajo, Mexican, white people, all together. People who don't fit nowhere else. They go there. They find peace. My uncle says you would be welcome, Ashki added. Your skills with water, with fixing things, these are valued. And you are family now. Family does not abandon family. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Leave everything. Walk away from Samuel's memory, from the only life she'd ever known. Admit defeat to men like Foss. But what exactly was she holding on to? A station nobody used? Property that meant nothing without people to share it? A husband who'd drunk himself to death and left her with nothing but loneliness? I don't know, Eunice whispered. This place is all I have. Desba reached across the table and took her hand. Some walls are prisons we build ourselves. The words cut clean through. Eunice thought about the past 2 years, the slow death of waking up to silence, the weight of being invisible, the pain of hearing laughter that was always at her expense. She'd been mourning a life that had been killing her long before Samuel died. If I go, she said slowly, Foss wins. He gets this land for nothing. He gets empty dirt, Hasty and Nez said through Desba. You get life. One of the other elders spoke, and Desba nodded. She says the land does not care who owns it, but people care who loves them. You must choose what matters. Eunice looked around the table at faces that had become familiar. Ashki, who called her brave. Desba, who taught her songs while they worked. Hasti and Nez, who'd given her a blanket because he cared if she was cold. These strangers had seen her humanity when her own people had looked away. I need time, she said. But outside, torches appeared on the horizon. Dozens of them, moving fast. Foss wasn't waiting for the marshal's deadline. He was coming to finish this tonight. The warriors moved like water, fast and silent. Within seconds, they'd formed a defensive perimeter, rifles ready, while the women disappeared into the darkness with Ashki. Hasti and Nez barked orders, and half his men melted into positions Eunice couldn't even see. Get inside, Desba urged, pulling at Eunice's arm. But Eunice stood frozen, watching those torches grow closer. 20, maybe 25 men. Foss had gathered every hate-filled soul within riding distance, probably promised them land, or whiskey, or just the thrill of violence. They stopped 100 yards out, close enough for their voices to carry. Eunice Hadley! Foss's shout cut through the night. You've got 1 minute to send those savages packing. After that, we're coming in. And whatever happens is on your head. Hasty and Nez appeared beside her, his rifle held loose but ready. He said something in Navajo, his tone asking permission. He wants to know if you want us to fight, Desba translated. Eunice looked at this man who'd shown her more respect in 10 days than Bitter Creek had in 2 years. Then she looked at the mob gathered to destroy him and everyone she'd come to love. Something crystallized in that moment, a clarity so sharp it cut through every doubt. She wasn't going to let these men turn her home into a graveyard, not for Foss's greed, not for anyone's hatred. This place had already died. She'd been the only one too stubborn to see it. No fighting, she said firmly. We leave, all of us, right now. Hasty and Nez studied her face, then nodded once. He turned and gave orders that sent his warriors into controlled motion. 30 seconds! Foss yelled. Eunice walked to her shed with Desba at her side. Inside, she grabbed the blanket Hasti and Nez had given her, her mother's silver brush, and the photograph of her parents. Everything that mattered fit in her arms. The rest is just wood, she said. They moved through the darkness toward the horses. Ashki was already mounted, held steady by 2 warriors. The women had packed with impossible speed, their entire camp disappearing like it had never existed. Eunice climbed onto a horse behind Desba, her body awkward and uncertain. But strong hands steadied her. Time's up! Foss shouted, and the mob surged forward with their torches high. But they found only empty buildings and cold fire pits. Hastien Nez had led his people into the desert like smoke, and Eunice Hadley went with them. Behind her, flames began to eat her water station. She watched it burn without tears. That building had been her cage, and Foss was welcome to the ashes. Miles later, when they finally stopped to rest, Ashkey rode close. "You gave up everything." "No," Eunice said, surprised by the truth in her words. "I gave up nothing, and I'm going toward everything." The desert stars stretched overhead like promises, and for the first time in 2 years, Eunice Hadley felt like she was going home. 3 weeks later, Marshal Pruitt rode to what remained of Bitter Creek Station. He found charred wood and Gideon Foss sitting on the ruins like a king on a worthless throne, deed in hand, smile on his face. "She ran off with the savages," Foss said. "Abandoned her property. Makes it legally forfeit." Pruitt looked at the ashes and said nothing. He'd seen enough burned dreams to know the difference between victory and theft. But the law was the law, and Eunice Hadley was gone. 60 miles northeast, morning light painted Three Rivers Trading Post in shades of gold. The compound sat where 3 seasonal streams met, creating a small oasis that supported gardens, livestock, and the 40 families who'd found refuge there. Eunice stood in the communal courtyard, watching children play a game that mixed English, Spanish, and Navajo rules into something entirely new. A Mexican grandmother argued cheerfully with a white trader over the price of cornmeal. Navajo women sang while grinding grain alongside wives of former soldiers who'd married into the tribe. This was chaos. This was beautiful. This was impossible by every rule she'd ever learned. This was home. "Grandmother who gave water." A small girl ran up and grabbed her hand. "Come see what we planted." The name still startled her. Ashkey had started it, and now everyone used it. Not Eunice the widow, not the elephant. A name that honored what she'd done instead of mocking what she was. She followed the girl to the medicine garden where Ashkey knelt between rows of healing plants, his hands deep in rich soil. He'd gained weight, his color fully returned, and he moved without pain now. "It grows strong," he said, gesturing to yarrow plants pushing toward the sun. "Like you." Eunice had lost 30 pounds from the hard work of building her new life, not from shame or starvation, but from purpose. She helped maintain the water system, taught children to read, learned beadwork from Desba, and discovered she had a talent for negotiating trades between cultures. Hastien Nez approached across the yard, moving easier now that his nephew was safe. He carried a leather pouch and pressed it into her hands. Inside were seeds for her mother's flowers, purchased from a trader who'd traveled all the way from Pennsylvania. "For your garden," Desba translated, appearing at his elbow. "So you remember where you came from." But Eunice was already home, not the place she'd left, but the people who'd chosen to see her. That evening, as families gathered for the communal meal, Eunice sat between Desba and Ashkey, surrounded by laughter in 3 languages. Someone told a joke she only half understood, but she laughed anyway because joy needed no translation. She'd given a dying stranger water, and he'd given her back her life. Not redemption for being different, but proof that different was just another word for belonging. In Bitter Creek, Gideon Foss owned empty land that grew nothing but resentment. At 3 Rivers, Eunice Hadley owned nothing except everything that mattered. And if that wasn't victory, nothing was. If you enjoyed this story of courage, kindness, and finding family in unexpected places, click that like button and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another incredible story that will touch your heart. We share these stories because everyone deserves to be reminded that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose love over fear. See you tomorrow.